Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait a few moments for everyone to join this webinar. For those of you who are already here, I would appreciate it if you could help us make sure that our technology is working well. Could you please use the chat feature to tell us what your favorite Halloween movie is? Again, if you're just joining us, welcome and thanks for being here. Please use the chat feature to help us test our technology by letting us know what your favorite Halloween movie is. All right, we have someone tuning in all the way from Bangladesh. We have someone saying Sleepy Hollow, a vote for Edward Scissorhands, which is one of my personal favorites. Halloween, another classic. Awesome. Thank you. Ooh, Nightmare Before Christmas. That might be my number one. Thank you all for helping us test our technology today. We are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome again. My name is Natasha Kathari, and I'm an Assistant Director of Admissions at Clark University. I will be your host for today's session, which focuses on research at Clark University. This event is part of the Clarktoberfest series, which is a month-long celebration of everything that makes Clark, well, Clark. I am joined today by three wonderful panelists. Professor Michael Boyer, an associate professor of physics who also chairs the physics department. Morgan Hilton, a pre-law senior studying English with a concentration in comparative race and ethnic studies and a minor in community, youth, and education studies. And James Nightingale, a senior double majoring in screen studies and psychology. I'm going to have each of them tell you a little more about themselves in just a moment, but first I want to offer a couple of guidelines for how we'll be using technology during today's section. All right. So first you're going to notice that we have both a Q&A feature and a chat feature. We're going to be using these two features for different functions today. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask our panelists, please use the Q&A feature. And if you're having an issue with the technology that we're using today, please use the chat feature. Again, questions, Q&A, and then for chat, that's technology and I suppose any other Halloween movies that you want to drop in as a recommendation. We'll do both of those in chat. Now, if you're asking a question using the Q&A feature, note that you might not see it right away. And that's because in order to ensure that as many audience members as possible can get their questions answered, we're going to be queuing up your questions one at a time. We will be answering some questions on air and some by text, but since there are a lot of you tuning in right now, I do want to apologize in advance if we don't make it to your question. If we don't get to your question during this webinar, or if you think of other questions, definitely feel free to reach out to us at admissions@clarku.edu. Okay, let's get started. So as I mentioned earlier, we have three panelists here this afternoon. And so that you have a better idea of their roles at Clark, the type of questions that they might be able to answer, I'd like to have each of them tell you a little more about themselves and the many, many hats that they wear at Clark. And we'll just go in the order on the screen. So Professor Boyer, I will start with you.
Thank you, Natasha, and certainly welcome everyone. So I'm Mike Boyer. I am the chair of the physics department. I joined Clark in 2011, so I guess I'm in my 10th year now. In terms of courses I teach across the physics curriculum. Right now I'm teaching classical mechanics, but I often teach other courses such as quantum mechanics and electricity and magnetism. In terms of my research interests, my main area of focus is in solid state physics. So I'm interested in the physics of metals, semiconductors, superconductors. In particular, I'm an experimentalist. In my laboratory, we use a technique called scanning tunneling microscopy to study these materials on an atom by atom basis. So our microscope actually can image the atomic structures of these materials and probe electronic properties on an atom by atom basis.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that, Professor Boyer. And Morgan, I'll have you go next.
Hi everyone, my name is Morgan. Like Natasha already mentioned, I'm a senior here at Clark studying English with two minors in really long names. So the acronyms are CRES and CS. So you can just shorten them to ethnic studies and education. I'll forgive you for that. And then I'm also on the pre-law track. And outside of my academics, I work for admissions. Obviously, I'm here. And I also am one of the chapter leaders for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, one of the executive editors for the Undergraduate Research Journal, and currently completing 2 independent research projects of my own. So those are obviously going to be the focus of the webinar. So I won't say too much about that now, but you'll hear loads about it a little bit later.
Fabulous. Thanks, Morgan. And James, on to you.
Hey all, I'm James. I use he, him pronouns. I'm from New York City originally, and I'm also a senior here. I'm double majoring in psychology and screen studies, and outside of academics, I'm super involved with this community-based organization called Big Brothers Big Sisters, which connects you with a little sib in the community that I meet with every week for a couple hours. It's this really great way to connect with someone from the Maine South Worcester community. I'm also super involved with theater here on campus, and I work with the Outing Club, which gets students into nature and away from campus. Yeah, and I work really closely with Professor Goldberg in her lab, so I'm a senior lab manager for her research, and I'm also doing a research project of my own, which similarly to what Morgan said, I'll definitely highlight and touch on more very soon.
We are so lucky to have the 3 of you here with us. And one thing I was thinking of as the 3 of you were talking is that whether you're a faculty member or a student, I think that Clarkies really like to stay busy. So thank you for kind of sharing a little bit of what's keeping each of you busy. Now, as we talk about research at Clark University, we're going to have each of our panelists share a little bit about their research and about getting involved in research at Clark. I'm going to start out with Professor Boyer, who is going to explain how students can get involved in research, a little bit more about his own research, and about some of the students who have worked in his lab.
Excellent. So I think you can hear just from the panel that the research opportunities at Clark are broad, and they're even broad within the physics department. So active research areas in the physics department go anywhere from studying fundamental physics of quantum systems, which is my personal interest, but to studying infectious disease transmission, such as COVID in particular, and studying complex biological and ecological systems. So there's a lot of breadth. And one of the questions is how to get involved with research. And really, I think this starts with a conversation. So a student reaches out to a specific faculty member with whom they might want to work. So for example, a student may just stop by my office, or they may drop me an email and ask to meet to talk a little bit about my research. These may be students that I've had in classes, or students I've never had but have heard about my research. And so it's a nice conversation, and I can talk a little bit about a research. I think if you get any faculty member and you ask them about their research, they will want to talk with you for a long period of time to talk about their research. But not only do I like to talk about my research, I encourage students to talk to other faculty members to hear about their research, because there are many different research areas and different approaches. So in physics, we have theoretical work, computational work, experimental work, and students have different interests. And so by speaking with a faculty member, you can figure out an area that might fit well with your specific interests. So I think this is a common way for students to find out about research and get involved, first by speaking with faculty members. Something that I like to do before a student, or if a student's trying to still figure out if they want to get involved with a project, is I'll invite them to our weekly group meetings. And so it's a chance in a very low pressure environment to hear what other students in our research group are doing and see whether it's an area that they want to get involved with themselves. In terms of opportunities, there are a number of opportunities for getting involved with research, both during the semester and during the summer. So during the semester, a common way to get involved with research is by taking a directed study. So this is a independent study course where a student earns credit, but there are also volunteer opportunities. So some students say, I want to get involved with research, but I have a heavy course load this semester. I'm doing a number of extracurriculars. So I'm not really sure about the time that I'll have, and the time available may vary throughout the semester. So volunteering is a nice way for students when they have time to participate in a research project. During the summer, there are a number of opportunities for students to get involved with research. Some departments in physics in particular, as well as certainly the other sciences, we host an 8 to 10 week summer research program for undergraduates. So this is a nice opportunity for students to focus purely on research. They don't have to worry about balancing classes with research. And there's often funding available. So university funds, department funds, or funding from individual faculty members, possibly through grants. So just to give you an idea in terms of the physics department in particular, we typically host about 15 plus students on campus during the summer to participate in our summer research program. So, and I guess one of the things I want to emphasize, and you'll hear from the other panelists, that what I think is really nice about Clark, what is unique about Clark, is really that we're very interested in having undergraduates get involved with research and early on. So it's not something that you have to wait till your senior year to participate in a meaningful project. You know, we have first years and sophomores getting involved with these projects. We go to the next slide. In terms of some of the specifics of the research I do, so I'm an experimentalist, and I study the physics contained within metal semiconductors and superconductors. So in the middle, you see an image of a microscope, which we have in my laboratory. It's a scanning tunneling microscope, and that microscope actually sits inside of this larger vacuum chamber to the right. And we use this microscope to image the atomic structures of materials. So you see 4 of these images on the left. These are 4 different materials that we're studying. And my hope is that in these images, you can see some of the atoms that comprise the material. And we're talking about imaging individual atoms. And you can see in these images, even though this is a very small length scale that we are examining, there are changes over that length scale. So we're very much interested in how the physics of these materials vary on an atom-to-atom basis. In terms of the types of work students can do in my laboratory, it really, in part, depends on a student's interest. So there's experimental work, working directly with our microscope to acquire data. But there's also other opportunities to develop instrumentation. So we make lots of other types of measurements, strain measurements, resistance measurements, and that often involves building setups and interfacing instruments. So that's a nice opportunity for students. Students also can get involved with analysis. So we have these images, but there's a lot of image processing and analysis we do. So in particular, we're interested in periodic features that appear in these images so as to determine their origin. And then there's also computational modeling. So we like to use simple models to simulate our data. The data itself can be complex and messy. So students can work on trying to distill the major features that we see in our images using simple models. And if we can reproduce our data, then we get some insight into the essential physics of these systems. We can go on to the next slide. In terms of what students have gone on to do, so this is a picture of my research group just a couple years ago, which includes actually both undergraduates and graduate students. Undergraduates who've worked with me have gone on to, a number of them go on to physics graduate programs. So recently they've gone to UC Berkeley, Cornell, University of British Columbia, Tufts University, University of Maryland, University of North Carolina. Others go on to engineering and material science graduate programs, including Columbia, UConn, Texas Tech. Others go into finance or computer science. A number of students take advantage of the Master's in Education program that we have at Clark and go on into teaching. And then others join the workforce directly. So I've had students get involved with renewable energy startups, programming positions, and designing medical systems. So that's a little bit about how to get into research from my point of view, and some of the work that we do in my group.
That was awesome, Professor Boyer. Thank you so much. Really quickly, that teaching master's program that Professor Boyer mentioned is our MAT program, which is part of our 5th-year accelerated combined master's bachelor's program. About 30% of students will take advantage of that 5th-year program and complete any of over a dozen different master's degrees in just 1 additional year and without paying any tuition. So definitely a really exciting benefit that we have at Clark University for our students. Now, Professor Boyer, I do have a couple of questions for you. First of all, I know that you talked a little bit about some of the responsibilities that undergraduates in your lab sometimes take on and how they can vary a little bit. Would you say that the level of responsibility changes with time, though?
So what a student does, it really depends on, I think, their personal interests, as well as how long that they've worked in the group. So some students want to focus purely on programming-based projects, and there's certainly plenty of those. Others like to tinker and build things. Usually a student who works in my lab for a few semesters can get involved with multiple aspects. So combining modeling with data acquisition, or can work on, we work on an array of materials, so they may work on a number of different materials. So it really varies from person to person and on their interests.
Got it, thank you. And you did briefly touch on this, but it's something that I'm really excited about. Why do you think Clark is a good fit for students who are interested in doing research?
What drew me to Clark, and I think what makes Clark unique, is that we're a liberal arts research institution. So I spent a fair amount of time at large research universities, and really it felt like the focus was on faculty research, often at the expense of undergraduate education. And then when I was in a purely liberal arts college, the pendulum swung a little bit the other way. So I really feel that at Clark, the research and the teaching have been equally valued. And this provides, I think, tremendous opportunities for undergraduates in research. So, thinking more of a scientific or science perspective here, we have world-class laboratories with funding that is really, the university invests in really nice toys for our laboratory to help do our research. And so when undergraduates get involved, they get involved with really nice instrumentation. We have them work on problems that we care about. So we're not putting together a research experience purely as a standalone experience for the student. We really want them to get involved with something that we care about and that they can have an impact on. So I've had a number of undergraduate students who are co-authors and even first authors on peer-reviewed papers in high-impact journals. So I think these are experiences that are fairly unique to Clark, particularly the ability for undergraduates to get involved with high-impact, meaningful research.
Folks, you heard it here first. If you want to play with really cool toys, you should do research at Clark. But in all seriousness, Professor Boyer, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and your experiences and your work with students with us. Now we're going to hear from some students who are doing research in a couple of different groups and through a couple of different projects. So a fun fact while we start that off is that about 60% of Clark's undergrads engage in formal research. So going back to what Professor Boyer said earlier about that emphasis that Clark places on undergraduate education and undergraduate research, proofs in the pudding. So some students like Morgan even double dip. As she mentioned earlier, Morgan is involved in 2 different research projects right now. But I'm actually going to start off by having her take a little walk down memory lane. So Morgan, hi.
Hi.
How and when did you get involved in research at Clark?
So it's kind of funny to think about because high school me would never have thought I would be doing a research webinar. I was one of those high school students where when I was like touring colleges and people were like talking about research, I was like, I don't know what that is. I don't care what that is. I just wish people would stop talking about it. I'm never going to do research. It's not for me. Because in my mind, research was just like, I don't know, you chilled in like a STEM lab and didn't talk to anyone and just, I don't, played with pipettes, I guess. I don't know. That was my perception of research. So I really was not interested in it going into college. And that kind of started to change my freshman year. I came into college thinking I wanted to do editing and publishing, like long term as a career. So I got involved with the undergraduate research journal as a copy editor. And I think reading the pieces that I was copy editing really started to change my perspective. I read a really interesting piece about like expressions of like toxic masculinity, like within prison cells. I read a like English piece that was about like queer food literature, like really interesting stuff. So I think I was like, oh, like maybe this isn't too bad. So it kind of started to like appear on my radar, but it wasn't really until my first year or my sophomore year, excuse me, where I started to kind of dive enough into my education and have enough kind of career experiences and personal experiences that I started kind of developing questions that I thought I might actually be prepared to answer that people hadn't answered yet. So that was kind of like I remember I came up with my English honors thesis topic actually the second semester of my sophomore year, and it shockingly stayed the same. That's what I'm studying now. So I think I kind of started to develop questions throughout the course of my Clark experience, but I didn't actually start doing kind of the long-term independent research until my junior year, until this past spring. Yeah.
Morgan, I love this idea of framing research as questions that you really, really want an answer to that no one's answered yet. That's fabulous. Yeah. So given that you're working on two different research projects, I can guess that you have at least two questions that you want to answer. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about those.
Yeah, so I'll start with my my English thesis because I came up with that one first. We'll just keep up with the memory lane and the chronology. So for my English honors thesis, I'm studying letters and epistolary novels, which are novels written through letters that were written by Black women in America. I'm basically, this project kind of started off reading conduct literature and other very conservative early American literature geared towards white women, basically teaching them how to be proper women that often utilize the epistolary form. So I kind of started reading some of that for an early American writers class and was really just interested in the use of epistles and how that they were very much like governed by social conduct, but also like able to be manipulated in really, really cool feminist ways. So I kind of, that was in the back of my mind. And then I took an African-American literature class the next semester, and reading The Color Purple, I was like, oh, this works in a very different way than everything else I had read. And basically all of the scholarship on letters and epistolary novels focused basically exclusively on white women's work, with the occasional sprinkling in of like, look at The Color Purple, it's there too. So I really wanted to dive into this topic and kind of take a historical approach, looking at how letters written by Black women sort of evolved into epistolary novels that we see today. The Color Purple is in there, but also some more contemporary works, An American Marriage, The Age of Phyllis. So starting all the way back with Phyllis Wheatley letters and going up until 2020, actually. My most recent work was published earlier this year. So looking at how letters provided a medium for more subversive kind of political identity, identity construction, political messaging, communication, sexuality, all of these different things than for Black women than traditional kind of publication methods allowed. So that is my English thesis. So I'll be writing a big long paper throughout the course of this year about that. That's kind of how a thesis works. At least in the English department. And I think most humanities, that's also kind of how a thesis works. And then my other project, I was actually telling Natasha before we just started this off, because she's friends with my research advisor. My other project is in the sociology department with Professor Jack Delahanty, and I really just kind of stumbled into that. I had recently dropped from a double major to a major and a minor and a concentration, so I had a couple of free classes, and my English advisor was like, oh, there's a pretty new professor here at Clark who is studying progressive religious activism. That's kind of his thing, and I know that that's an identity you have, so I think you should take a class with him. So I just took activism, protests, and social movements, and throughout the course of the class, I did a research paper on Christianity and Christian organizations in the criminal justice sphere. And I was just kind of like reading other literature, but I was like, I've worked in some organizations that are Christian, working in prisons and things like that. I was like, this doesn't really fit my experience. So I just kind of on a whim, literally a week before a research fellowship deadline for the summer, I said, let's do this. Let's take this further. Let's try doing this over the summer. And thankfully, Professor Delahanty was like all in with my really quick application. So I applied to be a Steinbrecher Fellow, which is one of our independent research fellowships here. They fund across disciplines, and it's a really cool kind of cohort program. There are a lot of different kind of people doing different research there, and it's a lot of fun to be a part of that program. But so I got approved to conduct interviews with individuals working in Christian organizations, specifically evangelical prison ministries, to interview them and understand a little more about the language that they use to construct their mission and their political identities and their theological identities, and hopefully understand a little bit more about how we can unify these actors with a more progressive criminal justice reform movement. So I, again, decided to continue it again into this year, and so I've been in the process of coding these interviews, formulating my thesis. I'm really excited. There are some interesting findings that haven't shown up in a lot of the literature that I've read, at least. So hopefully over winter session, I'll wrap that up and have a final paper to be submitted to hopefully publication.
Wow, that is incredible, Morgan. Best of luck with that. You'll definitely have to keep us updated. One last question for you. So you mentioned earlier that you're really involved in Surge, Clark's scholarly undergraduate research journal. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and about other opportunities for students to showcase their research?
Absolutely. So Surge is an entirely undergraduate run and only publishing undergraduate research across disciplines here at Clark. So I'm on the editorial board now, but I used to be a staff member. I definitely recommend if research is something you're interested in, which I would assume it is if you are all here, getting involved with that even in your first semester here at Clark, because it's a really good opportunity to kind of get, you read, like actually peer review and copy edit actual submissions and kind of get to understand how academic language works. We'll be sure to match you up with something in your interest area. So just a quick plug, join our staff if you come to Clark. It's a really good opportunity to kind of start to get your bearings in research. But we also accept submissions from all undergraduates of any year, any discipline, anything. You can submit a full-length article. You can also, for this year, for the first time, we're also accepting shorter like STEM communications. I will be honest, I don't totally know what a communication is in STEM, but I heard it's a little bit shorter, taking some abstracts. So we accept a lot of different types of publications. And it's really cool to like go through the double-blind peer review process and then actually see your work printed. I know that that's a really powerful moment during our like finale dinner where everyone like gets to see the book. They're like, that's me, I'm in there. So it's really exciting. Additionally, we also have two kind of undergraduate only research symposiums, Fall Fest, which usually occurs in the fall, but this year is occurring virtually over our winter session. So that's now Winter Fest. So winter/Fall Fest. And then Academic Spree Day in the spring. So that's kind of the picture you see up top with all of the posters. Students will present posters about their research experiences, either through the school year or through the summer. I believe people doing honors theses, I should figure this out because I'm doing an honors thesis, also often defend their theses or present their theses on that day. So it's a really, really special day where everyone in the Clark community kind of gets to see what everyone's been working on for the past year.
Fabulous. Thank you for that, Morgan. Quick note for those of you who are tuning in, by the way, we are starting to get some questions in the Q&A feature. So if you have questions that you want to ask our panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A now, and we'll get to them towards the end of this presentation. But you don't have to wait until then to ask. So next, we're going to hear from James, and we're going to hear about his research in the psychology department. So as you might recall, James is a lab manager in Professor Abby Goldberg's Diverse Families and Sexualities Lab and is working on independent research for his honors thesis. Hi, James. How's it going?
Hey, doing good.
Glad to hear it. So I'm going to start with you, much the same way I started with Morgan, and have you look back in time as well. So when did you first get involved in research at Clark and how?
Yeah, absolutely. So research for me started, psychology is a particularly broad, and you'll get this with a lot of like introductory classes in your first year, that perhaps it's a larger class, and psychology is a pretty large discipline. So when I knew I was interested in psychology going into my time here at Clark, but I wasn't sure what specifically that was going to look like. So I was taking Psych 101 and looking at the different chapters and really trying to feel it out, and nothing was particularly clicking right away. One of my friends, actually, who was a junior at the time and participating in Dr. Goldberg's lab, told me about this professor and the research that she's doing, and the kinds of classes that she teaches. Very broadly, she talks about sexuality studies and adoption studies. So she's looking at LGBTQ identifying parents and their adopted children, and what that relationship looks like, and the specific kinds of struggles and challenges that queer identifying parents encounter. And I thought that was so fascinating. But for the longest time, I was too afraid to like take that first step of reaching out and like sending an email to Professor Goldberg to ask her about if I could help out in her research in any capacity. And it wasn't until the second semester of my first year, so still pretty early on, but like towards the second semester, I took a class with Professor Goldberg on human sexuality, and that was a super mind-opening, like really, really excellent class. It also coincided with me kind of coming to terms with my own queerness and my own identity. So I was feeling more comfortable and confident in myself. And I think there was this combination of events that led me to send this email out to Professor Goldberg to say like, hey, I'm really enjoying your class, and I've heard some things about your research. I would love to get involved. And she said, essentially, she was like, this sounds great, but you need to apply through my website. She was like, go to my website and apply, and we'll get back to you. And so I did. And so I like learned more about her research and what specifically she was doing. And I tailored an application for that specific lab. And I was one of the few people that she let into her lab. Part of the psychology major is you have to be involved in some kind of hands-on research at some point throughout your Clark career. So everyone has to do that at one point or another. But I got super lucky in the fact that like I got to be involved with this specific lab that I was really excited about. So that carries me into my junior year, which is when I started getting super heavily involved with the lab. So I think I mentioned this a little bit before, but like what I do in the lab with Abby and with the other people who are a part of the lab, we all are essentially transcribing. Her study is this 20-year-long longitudinal look at queer parents and their adopted kids. So every 3 or so years, they'll have interviewers call the parents and check in with them and ask them a bunch of questions. The most recent round of interviews happened actually over the summer. So we asked a lot of questions surrounding COVID and how parents are adapting to the pandemic and what that looks like. So we have this like incredible, enormous amount of data about parents and how they adapt to different challenges. So a lot of the lab hours are spent transcribing audio data into like typed out words, coding that data, and then discussing that data in class. We also do a lot of readings on adoption. This year specifically, we're looking at transracial adoption, which is when a parent adopts a child of a different race than their own, and the different complications that arise from that. So we're doing hands-on research, and then at the same time, we're discussing academic and theoretical approaches to that research and ways to make that more intersectional. So that's how I got involved with that research project with Abby's lab. And now, of course, I'm the senior lab manager, so I help run the lab alongside the other grad student lab managers. I make sure everyone's getting their hours in and that productivity is feeling people are doing okay emotionally and like feeling good about their work. And that basically led me into finally my senior thesis, which is what I'm doing now, and which is the photo that you see right there. And I'm happy to talk more about that in a second.
Thanks, James. I was actually going to ask about your role as lab manager, so I appreciate you kind of expanding on what your responsibilities are in that role and kind of how your duties in the lab have changed as a result of that. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about your independent research. What are you doing, and what's this graphic that everyone's looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of weird. Like it's definitely one of the more, like when I tell people about my research, people are like, really, you're doing research in that, which is part of what I personally love about it. I am researching LGBTQ identifying individuals' relationships to sending and receiving explicit photography, which is commonly like referred to as nudes. And I'm really fascinated by this relationship between queer people and digital online space. I think there's a lot to be said about the ways that we express intimacy, the ways that queer people have unique relationships with their bodies and their identities and their placement within the queer community at large. And this idea that sending and receiving these explicit images has somehow become like a part of queer culture and like is something that's expected from someone if you identify as queer. I was really interested in investigating that and to what extent people thought that was true, depending on how they identified. So that's my flyer. I actually just put this up a couple days ago, and it's been super well received so far, which is really exciting. I'm getting responses from a bunch of like people that I know, although of course it's all anonymous, so I'll never actually know who it is. The whole survey is completely anonymous, but it's just, I feel super privileged to get this very intimate private window into the way that people are expressing themselves. You get this really unique and incredible amount of information about intimacy and about like people's relationship with their bodies, and that's been super cool. So that's broadly what I'm working on, and so right now I'm in the process of collecting research. As I'm doing that, and I'm also starting to actually write the thesis itself, which is a full year-long project. It involves just like doing outside research, so I have to look at the kinds of studies that have been done in this area before, in sexuality studies, in digital media studies, and craft a kind of summary of that, and feed that into whatever result I make of this qualitative data. Yeah, so that's currently what I'm looking at. What I wanted to highlight quickly is just like how open my advisor, so Abby Goldberg, who also is advising the study, she's my advisor. I've developed this really great close relationship with her. And when I brought this up to her, I was actually abroad in London. So we were separated by an ocean. I sent an email out to her being like, I have this crazy weird idea to investigate queer people's relationships to like sending and receiving nude photography. Is this something I can do at all remotely? And she was like, yeah, that's really weird, but let's explore it and let's see what we can do. So she really walked me through the process of building an application and submitting it to the Institutional Review Board, which made sure it was an ethical study. She helped me get all my paperwork in and really fine-tune my specific research questions and exactly how I wanted to approach this theoretically. So I just felt really supported, especially with an issue that can sometimes be taboo and people don't feel super comfortable talking about. There was this potential that I would get a pushback or like this reaction that people don't maybe want to hear about this research. They're not interested in funding or like advising me in this area. When instead I was really supported and validated and like told that this was something I should absolutely explore, which was super valuable.
Thank you for that, James. And thank you to Morgan and Professor Boyer as well for sharing your expertise and your insights with all of us. For those of you who are tuning in, we are looking forward to answering your questions, so feel free to post them in the Q&A section if you haven't already. I do want to note that if you're interested in learning more about research at Clark, you can go to the URL on your screen, which is www.clarku.edu/academics/research. So definitely feel free to check that out. All right, so we are going to go ahead and take your questions. Just a reminder to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. The first couple of questions I'm going to pose to Professor Boyer. They relate to timing, and so I'm curious to know kind of your experiences over kind of all the different students you've worked with. First question is kind of how early you would recommend that students dive into research projects, and then there's another question about how early students can get involved in research at Clark.
Okay, so I've had seniors start research with me. I've had sophomores and juniors, and I'm trying to think back if I've ever had a first year who started research with me. So I don't think there's anything that prohibits a first year getting involved with research. I think it depends on that student and perhaps their background, because we often, even in the physics department, we think about projects that sometimes during the summer a high school student can get involved with. So there should be opportunities, regardless of your background, to get involved. But sometimes it does make sense to cover some of the introductory material before getting involved with research and knowing what some of those opportunities are on campus. And so possibly waiting to sophomore year could make sense. But certainly I'd say by sophomore year, there's really, if you're interested in getting involved with research, there's nothing really I think that would be keeping you back.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that, Professor Boyer. Next, we have a question that I am going to ask to, let's say James, since you studied abroad. How does research look different when studying abroad?
Yeah, it's a great question because I had to tackle this as well. The answer I think will depend on the kind of research that you're doing and whether or not it needs to be super hands-on and in the lab. I think it'll depend, like if you're doing more theoretical research that happens online and you're doing a lot of writing, that could certainly continue while you're abroad. I know for my personal experience when I was working in Abby Goldberg's lab, her policy is that you can't continue to be a part of the lab when you're abroad because so much of the work that you're doing happens in person when you're on the computer, transcribing the physical audio documents, and that's something that couldn't be made digital. And so she basically asks, like, if you choose to go abroad, you then come back and continue your lab work when you're back at Clark. And that was no issue with me because I really enjoyed what I was doing, so I was fine to take a quick break. So I'd started with the lab right before I left, so I spent this fall semester of my junior year doing lab work with Abby. Then I left for abroad in the spring, and now I'm back here in the fall, and I'm continuing this research and lab work throughout the rest of the year.
Awesome, thank you, James. Next question I'm going to pose to Morgan. So we have a student asking if there are classes that they should take before doing research. So did you take any classes in preparation for either of your projects?
So I took some classes that definitely helped me out, but no, I didn't really take anything that was like, okay, this is a long-winded answer, I'm sorry. For my sociology one, definitely not. I had happened to take a qualitative methods class to fulfill requirements in one of my minors, and that definitely helped me out, but it wasn't like Jack, my advisor, like he didn't ask me if I had these requirements or anything like that. So it wasn't really like I needed them. It was just I happened to have them, and that was great. It was super helpful. For my English major, I think it was a little bit, or for my English project, I think it was a little bit different since I figured out what I wanted to do pretty like early on in my college career. So I was pretty intentional about taking like only African American literature classes in a really diverse range of kind of time periods. But I also know people who didn't do that necessarily and are still doing perfectly fine doing their honors thesis. So I would say no, but it probably would depend on the discipline. Yeah, I don't think there are a ton of specific requirements, but there are definitely like research methods classes and stuff like that if you know you're interested in doing research might definitely be helpful for you.
Great, thank you. So we are starting to run a little low on time, so I do want to ask our panelists just one last question. Remember that if you do have questions that we weren't able to answer tonight, if you have questions about maybe research in specific programs or majors, feel free to email us at admissions@clarku.edu, and we would love to get you more information. All right, folks. Final question of the afternoon. I feel like I should be doing a drum roll or something. This isn't actually research related, but for each of you, what makes Clark home? We'll start with Professor Boyer, and I guess we'll just move down my screen.
Okay. I certainly enjoy the blend of teaching and research at Clark, but I think most importantly, I enjoy working closely with students, undergraduate and graduate students. I spent a lot of time at larger research institutions, and as a student, I never knew my faculty member or the instructors or the professors. And so I really, at Clark, very much enjoy that I have an opportunity to know every one of my students.
Thank you for that. James, go for it.
Yeah, it's such a good question. What makes Clark home for me, it's like cliche, but it's like it has to be the people, and it has to be this sense of community. And it's like, it feels silly to say, but like it is so, you really, really feel it. And like, I feel it's like this sense of safety and collaboration and like silliness. People who aren't afraid to be weird, people who just like love, like truly, truly love to help people out just for the sake of being helpful. It's this super unique like community environment that Clark has crafted that continues to like shock me every day with just like how lovely and supportive it can be. Yeah, that's been really fun.
Thanks, James. And last but not least, Morgan.
I have to agree with James on this one, actually. I, just a little bit of background, came from a very competitive and intense high school, had a really demoralizing college kind of application process and admission cycle. And what actually made me choose Clark was just the sense, even from my very first accepted students day, that people, like other students there with me, the admissions ambassador, people, faculty members I talked to, everyone really wanted to get to know me like as a complete individual, even though I was just like a small prospective student. And I think that just meant the world to me. And just being in an environment where I've always been like a little bit of a dork. Like I really like my studies. I really like what I'm learning. And I think being in an environment where that's kind of the norm and everyone else is also really excited to hear about what I'm learning has been, yeah, really, really special for me and something that I've really appreciated about Clark.
Wow, well, folks, there you have it. I want to thank our panelists, Professor Boyer, James, Morgan, for sharing so much of their afternoon with us and sharing their experiences. It's been wonderful to learn from all of you. And to those of you who are tuning in, thank you for taking the time to join us. Clarktoberfest is almost done, but we do have one more event for you. Tomorrow, please join us at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Ask a Clarkie, which is your chance to ask the experts, current Clark students, about anything you want. It's always a super fun event, and I can't think of a better way to close out Clarktoberfest. And remember, if you have a United States mailing address and attend at least 3 Clarktoberfest webinars, we will mail you one of these sweet t-shirts. So be sure to register for tomorrow's event at clarku.edu/Clarktoberfest. Everybody loves a free t-shirt, right? If you have any more questions for us or just want to say hi, like I said, feel free to email us at admissions@clarku.edu. Again, thank you all for tuning in. We had so much fun answering your questions, and hopefully you'll get in touch if you need anything at all. Until next time, have a fun and spooky Halloween and stay well. Bye.